This is the 7th year of the Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship. Della, Hazel's sister, corrected me before, which was set up both to honour Hazel's work, but also crucially to support writers in the fields that she was so passionate about: biography, life writing. And Della, Hazel's sister, Lynn Buchanan and Rennie Tomaszewski have really kept this going and provided the momentum based on donations from family and friends. And each year, the judging panel includes eminent current writers. This year, Arnold Zabel and Jenny Hocking. So I know you'll all be holding your breath for an announcement of what the outcome is. I have an announcement, but it is that you will find out in 50 minutes. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight our speaker, Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking, who many of you will know, Emeritus Professor at Monash University, distinguished biographer, four key volumes, 2 of them on Whitlam, the life of Frank Hardy, the author of Power Without Glory, and also the wonderfully scurrilous Outcasts of Fulgara. She's written a biography of Lionel Murphy, no relation, and she's also most recently written the 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, 2008 and 2012. And then most recently, the Dismissal Dossier, everything you were never meant to know about November 1975, the Palace Connection. And Jenny's theme tonight is the politics of biography, and particularly the politics of the sources that we are not allowed to read. So, Jenny, it's a great pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you, John, for such a warm introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a very great honour to present the 2018 Hazel Rowley Memorial Lecture tonight. Hazel Rowley was an acclaimed biographer, essayist and public intellectual, whose many works, biographical and otherwise, explored the lives of exceptional men and women, often in partnership, always illuminating their lives, relationships and also their history. She was an exemplar of the possibility of biography. In Janet Malcolm's searing contemplation on the transgressive nature of biography, a form at which she herself excelled, by the way, she famously characterised the biographer as akin to a professional burglar, prying, snooping, trespassing, disinterring, and worse, making money from the lives of those who could no longer speak for themselves. While Malcolm's disdain for her own kind relates primarily to the more salacious, publicity-driven field of journalism as biography, her moral critiques are no less compelling for the consideration of the historian as biographer. If the biographical endeavour is inherently transgressive in Malcolm's ruthless takedown, then so too are the ethics of those practising this dark art, of which I am one. Like Malcolm, I too deplore the tendency in biography to take a life as it was lived and reconstituted as a sort of cheapened version of a biographical meme, based more on speculation than investigation and willfully constructing a scandalised life from a far more mundane political one. And you might like to take a look at my article in the latest Arena magazine on Lionel Murphy and the release of the Murphy Papers, where I take this further, and I highly recommend it. But is this really all that biography can ever be? The narrativisation of scandal, listening to backstairs gossip and reading other people's mail, as Janet Malcolm describes it. Is this really all there is for the biographer to aspire to? I want to make a larger, empiricist, a positively noble claim for biography tonight, and in particular for political biography, that it can and it should unsettle historical certainties. It should rattle the cage of a contested history, not through speculation, but through investigation. And in that case, biography becomes an exercise in writing history while at the same time transforming it. This transformative potential of biography lies in its very nature, or more precisely, in the nature of the research underpinning it. It's a forensic exercise through a heavily personalised research space. Days, months, years. I can attest to the years spent trawling over and sifting through the minutiae of a life, the details of which are so often overlooked in broader histories. The primacy of the source is the stock in trade of biography. Archives, contemporaneous records, original letters, private papers, personal interviews, all of which will give up new meanings at different times. Every biography, writes Richard Brophy, can be two books, one about its subject and the other about the adventures arising from the research. If that's the case, then tonight is about that other book. It's about the adventures arising from the research. I'll look at some critical archival encounters, revelations, abstractions, even destructions about Gough Whitlam and about the dismissal of his government, which have recast our knowledge and understanding of him and the history of his time. As a political scientist with an interest in the intersections of law and politics, working in the form of biography, I'm particularly interested in subjects whose own history and the history of their political interventions are contested. They're evolving and incomplete. Because it's in that incomplete space that the potential for biography to challenge historical knowledge, to shed new light on an old political controversy, and in the process transfigure the history of it, will be found. And biography then will be transgressive in a very different sense from that meant by Janet Malcolm, being politically and historically transgressive of an apparently settled history, rather than merely of the subject. But what all these contested narratives point to is the complexity and essential fragility of history and the ease with which a history can be confected. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the transformation of the history of the dismissal of the Whitlam government in recent years. Gough Whitlam was uniquely committed to history, to knowing it, documenting it and learning from it. And he was also, and extremely confidently, aware of his place in history. The marvellous Graham Freudenberg, Whitlam's long-term speechwriter, advisor and friend, refers to Whitlam's lifelong sense of taking part in history and his belief in the idea of history itself as progress by evolutionary steps. And Whitlam was often asked how he thought history would judge him, and he was fond of adopting Churchill's homily in reply: "I'm confident of the verdict of history, the more so because I intend to continue to write it myself." Now, that was for me a rather daunting introduction to my biographical subject and his undoubted sense of self. But nevertheless, in many ways, that remark is typical Whitlam. The bravado leavened by a hint of self-mocking, the acknowledgement of the significance of writing history as well as making it, together with more than just a kernel of truth. Because Whitlam did write the verdict of history about him and about his government several times over in numerous of his own works. I think the best known of these is without doubt his weighty tome, The Whitlam Government. It's a standard reference and a really fantastic one. It was prepared with the great assistance of his youthful research assistant, Mark Latham. And Whitlam would always later say that he thought this was Latham's best work. Whitlam was also deeply committed to the preservation of history. And you can see this in his government's initiatives in open government, in particular the establishment of the forerunner of the National Archives, which was the Australian Archives, and moves towards the introduction of freedom of information laws. And both those things have been critical to unpacking the real story of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. With the release of his government's 1975 cabinet papers by the National Archives, which was in 2005, Whitlam said, "The publication of these records confirms my belief in the contemporary document as the primary source for writing and understanding history." Whatever our virtues or failings, he said, there is no secret history of the Whitlam government. Well, there may have been no secret history of the Whitlam government, but there has most certainly been a secret history of the dismissal of his government. And let me just recap on some of those circumstances in case there are some of you who are not what I would call as focused, you might call it as obsessed, with this event. So the wrap is this. Gough Whitlam and his entire ministry were dismissed by the Queen's representative in Australia, the Governor General, Sir John Kerr, on the 11th of November 1975. In its place, Kerr appointed a government led by the leader of the Liberal Country National Party opposition, Malcolm Fraser, which had lost the previous two elections, which did not have a majority in the House of Representatives, and which then lost a motion of no confidence in the House by 10 votes later that afternoon. Whitlam had arrived at Yarralumla to finalise the half-Senate election, which he was set to announce in Parliament that afternoon. For nearly 4 weeks, the opposition senators had refused to vote on the government supply bills, that is, the government's money bills, and in the new political vernacular, supply was blocked. It wasn't rejected, it hadn't even been voted on, but it was blocked. Calling the half-Senate election had always been Whitlam's resolution to this unprecedented situation from the outset. And there was never any secret about this. Kerr himself was well aware that the half-Senate election was to be the end point of the stalemate over supply. Whitlam had told Kerr on the 6th of November that he had decided to call the half-Senate election and that he would announce it in the House of Representatives on the 11th of November. The necessary paperwork was then exchanged with Government House. The wording of the announcement was confirmed with Kerr on the very morning of the 11th of November. When Whitlam arrived at Yarralumla, he thought to finalise these agreed arrangements for the half-Senate election. He was instead dismissed without warning. The dismissal was the culmination of months of political subterfuge, planned in secrecy and executed in deception. It created a deeply polarised history, marked as much by myth as fact, and rent by the same divisions as the dismissal itself. In the 43 years since, even its most basic facts that were once considered settled have proved to be false. A dominant dismissal narrative soon took shape, which we now know was marked by errors, omissions, and too often outright distortions. Central to it was the view that the Governor-General acted alone, that he had no prior contact with the Leader of the Opposition, Malcolm Fraser, that the Queen did not know, that this was a solo act, a lonely and isolated decision taken in solitude. As Kerr himself put it, I made up my mind on my own part. It was simple, straightforward, and untrue. In recent years, this long-standing dismissal narrative has comprehensively unravelled, as newly released archival records, interviews, and the confessional reminiscences of ageing participants have gradually told a different story. We owe it to the disgruntled former minister in the Fraser government, the ruthless Senate leader, Reg Toe-Cutter Withers, for revealing what had long been suspected, and that is that Fraser and Kerr had been in secret communication in the weeks before the dismissal, and they had agreed to the terms by which Kerr would dismiss Whitlam and appoint Fraser as Prime Minister. These secret discussions had been repeatedly and emphatically denied by Kerr and Fraser for decades, and it's this playing with the history of the event that I find almost as troubling as the events themselves in November 1975. And the records also finally reveal that far from the dismissal being a solo act by a lonely, burdened Governor-General, Kerr had for months confided in members of the High Court, legal academics at the ANU, the opposition, the Queen's private secretary, and even Prince Charles. Everyone seemed, except the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, about his role and in particular whether he had the power to dismiss a government. Kerr's papers also confirm what history now forgets, and that is Whitlam's intention to call the half-Senate election on the afternoon of the 11th of November. It was scheduled for the 13th of December. Whitlam's signed letter to the Governor-General advising the half-Senate election, their correspondence finalising the election date of the 13th of December and the announcement that Whitlam was to make in the House have all now been revealed and released by the archives. It's quite remarkable that although it was always clear Whitlam would call the half-Senate election if the Senate didn't vote on the supply bills, how quickly it soon disappeared from historical view. Many of the more recent works on the dismissal simply ignore the half-Senate election altogether. But it re-emerges now as a critical factor in the revised history of the dismissal, which I discuss at length in the Dismissal Dossier, which is for sale at the back of the room. In this fundamental recasting of the history of the dismissal, there's been no single holding more definitive than the papers of Sir John Kerr, which are held in the National Archives of Australia. It was there that I found Kerr's spine-tingling 12-page account of his secret meetings, discussions and planning with the then High Court Justice Sir Anthony Mason in the months leading up to the dismissal. Mason's role, we now know, was profound and far more significant than that of the Chief Justice Sir Garfield Barwick. For the next 37 years, Mason's role was kept secret from the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, from his fellow High Court Justices, and I argue in a piece I had last year about the 1974 election that I feel that this is an as yet unexplored area, that the failure to reveal to his fellow High Court Justices that ongoing conversation with Kerr, given some very important constitutional cases involving the Whitlam government's legislation, was actually is a really troubling aspect of it, I think, and not one that's been widely explored. And of course, Mason's role was kept from the Australian public for 37 years. His role was not merely one of guidance. It was not merely one of fortification of a friend. It was an active involvement in the dismissal itself. And we know that because Mason himself has since acknowledged that he had drafted a letter of dismissal for Kerr some days before the dismissal. And according to Paul Kelly in The Australian, the only tenable conclusion is that Mason was implicated in Kerr's dismissal of Whitlam. Nor should it be forgotten that in remaining silent, Mason was also protecting himself. Whitlam's Attorney General, Kep Enderby, on hearing of those revelations, described Mason's discussions with Kerr as scandalous and extraordinary. He said, "I'm horrified that a High Court judge was interfering in political matters like this." Former ministers from the Hawke and Keating governments made it clear that Mason would never have been appointed Chief Justice of the High Court in 1987 had they been aware he was secretly and extensively counselling Kerr in the lead up to the dismissal. But for nearly 4 decades, Mason maintained his silence, refusing to comment publicly. Despite Kerr's pleas that he do so, Kerr wanted him to reveal his role, and despite my pleas to him that he did do so, and therefore ensuring the continuing public ignorance of his role in the dismissal. When I put it to Mason that he should speak publicly about this, that he should put his side of the story, and that he should do so in the interests of history, he made the memorable and since much quoted response, "I owe history nothing." Well, I think he does owe history something, and in fact I think he owes history a great deal, because it was an extraordinary moment for our history. These revelations confirmed the worst possible aspects of the dismissal: the subterfuge, collusion and the deception that had long been suspected and always denied by the key protagonists, and the extent of other people's knowledge of Kerr's planning and his intentions. And they showed Mason not only as Kerr's right-hand man in the dismissal, but also as having failed to reveal that role and allowing a false historical narrative to take hold. The final point I want to make about this file revealing Mason's involvement is that it was actually never meant to be revealed to me. Kerr had intended this file to stay closed until after the death of all 4 protagonists in the dismissal, all of whom were mentioned in that remarkable document. However, you had to read through the document in total to see that Kerr was writing he had no intention of this being released until after the death of all of them, including Justice Mason, and you had to recognise its significance. So perhaps I was the unwitting beneficiary of years of cost-cutting by the Howard government, which cast out so much institutional memory at the National Archives. I like to think so. And there's no doubt at all that the inadvertent release of this critical file revealing Mason's role did cause a huge amount of consternation in the National Archives when they realised it. So much so that the Director General actually said to me himself later that they had considered withdrawing the file from public access, and with it my authority to publish from it, even though it had already been released to me. And the really important thing is this, that of course, had they done so, Mason's role and that aspect of the hidden history of the dismissal would still be hidden today. The discovery of that single file changed the history of the dismissal forever. The Australian described it as a discovery of historical importance. The dismissal narrative, which had for decades hinged on Kerr's insistence that this had been a solo act, that he had neither consulted with nor revealed his intentions to others, had shifted to one of collusion, deception and duplicity, with vastly different implications. It is the quintessential example of the capacity of political biography to transform our understanding of a particular historical juncture and to challenge long-standing interpretations of it. Kerr's papers opened the door to a hidden history, suspected yet still unknown. They constitute a belated corrective to the historical chimera that he had himself contrived. There have also been some intriguing examples of missing archives. And at the risk of sounding like Donald Rumsfeld, these are archival known unknowns. Archives that we know once existed, and for all we know they might still exist, however they cannot now be found. I have two examples, both of which, remarkably enough, involve an incinerator. One is a cache of letters to Sir John Kerr from the Queen's favourite cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and other prominent people supporting his action in dismissing Whitlam. In a remarkably partisan royal intercession, Mountbatten wrote to Kerr just days after the dismissal, congratulating him on his, quote, courageous and correct action in removing the Whitlam government. Kerr considered Mountbatten's letter of outstanding value, in his words, and the official secretary, David Smith, was tasked with sending it and the entire collection of congratulatory letters from unknown prominent individuals to Kerr in the south of France, where he had decamped after his resignation as Governor General. Now, what an absolutely fascinating historical trove they would have made. But sadly, this can never be, because these letters never made it to the south of France. In fact, they never made it out of the Yarralumla corridor. All these letters, including Mountbatten's, had, according to David Smith, been accidentally burnt in the Yarralumla incinerator by an overzealous cleaner, which was remarkably careless of the protectors of such significant and highly controversial historical documents held by Government House and which should have been placed in the National Archives. And we only know of the non-existence of these letters because of the contents of another file in the National Archives containing Kerr's correspondence with David Smith about the fate of these letters. So this encounter not only instances the creation of a missing archive, but it also exemplifies the mosaic nature of archival research, that several files, when pieced together, can reveal a picture that no single file alone could explain. And it's one of the really, wonderful moments in deep research is that you've spent so long in different archives that you recognise something from another part of it that will make something bigger than the component parts. But were it not for having located that second file of correspondence, the existence and apparent inflammatory end to Kerr's correspondence with his minor aristocratic supporters would never have come to light. My second example is of an unexpected ASIO file on Whitlam, which I found in another obscure reference, and again this was in a secondary file, not the original file, and it referred to a National Archives security file dating from the 1960s, so of course I requested access to it. And you can imagine my surprise, given that the file related to a former Prime Minister was of obvious significance and had already been in the archives for nearly 4 decades, when I received a reply saying that, in remarkably coincident timing, just weeks before I had requested access to it, this file had been destroyed, burnt as part of a regular review of the archives holdings. So clearly, incinerators play a very big role in the creation of a missing archive. So despite these gaps, some of which we're still exploring, Kerr's papers have proved to be a spectacular addition to the historical record. And they've also provided the first glimpse of the role of the palace in the dismissal. And although there are some who continue to claim that the palace was not involved, and really that's been reduced to just a few recalcitrant News Limited journalists and David Smith, this is increasingly more a matter of faith than of fact. Revelations from Kerr's papers, the palace letters, and the UK files of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that I discuss in the Dismissal Dossier Update, the Palace Connection, have rendered this position untenable. So what do we already know about this still emerging palace connection? Well, among Kerr's papers is a journal written in 1980, and there he describes his secret communications with Prince Charles and the Queen's private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, in the months before the dismissal. Kerr had confided to Charles as early as September 1975, 1 month before supply was even blocked in the Senate, that he was considering dismissing Gough Whitlam. In raising this with Charles, Kerr's chief concern was, as ever, for his own position. Kerr writes that he told Charles that he feared Whitlam might recall him as Governor General, should he become aware that he, Kerr, was secretly considering dismissing Whitlam as Prime Minister, which would not have been an entirely unreasonable move, you might have thought. And Kerr writes in that journal that Charles expressed dismay at the prospect, not of Whitlam's dismissal, but of Kerr's possible recall, telling him, "But surely, Sir John, the Queen should not have to accept advice, that you should be recalled, should this happen when you were considering having to dismiss the government." When you were considering having to dismiss the government. And this is in September 1975. Charles then relayed this extraordinary conversation to the Queen's private secretary, Charteris, who wrote to Kerr in October, reassuring him that if the contingency to which you refer should arise, the palace would, quote, try to delay things. And a handwritten note among Kerr's papers setting out his key points in the dismissal has at point 4, Charteris's advice to me on dismissal. This communication between Charles, the Queen's private secretary, and the Governor General is politically and constitutionally shocking. It reveals the palace to be in deep intrigue with Kerr and agreeing to protect his tenure as Governor General should Whitlam move to recall him in the months before the dismissal. It has since been confirmed by the former official secretary David Smith that Kerr and Charteris were in secret communication over the Governor General's position before the dismissal, in a breathtaking rupture of the vice-regal relationship, at the heart of which in a constitutional monarchy is that the appointment of the Governor General is made by the Queen on the advice of the Australian Prime Minister alone. So for the Queen's private secretary to intervene with Kerr himself on the question of his tenure was a staggering breach of that relationship. From that point on, knowing that Kerr was considering dismissing Whitlam and having agreed to a course of action in order to protect his position should Whitlam do so, the palace was already involved in the dismissal. These letters between Charteris and Kerr are part of the so-called palace letters between the Governor-General and the Queen, her private secretary and Prince Charles, in the months before the dismissal. They're held by our own National Archives in Canberra, not for access by us, but for protection from us. The palace letters are embargoed until 2027, at Her Majesty the Queen's instructions, with her private secretary retaining an indefinite veto over their release even after that date. So in other words, it's quite possible that the palace letters may never be released. Kerr's letters were frequent, even obsessive. At times he wrote to the palace several times in a single day, and there are apparently dozens of letters written over just a few weeks. At the heart of this still secret royal correspondence was the prospect of the dismissal of the Whitlam government, which Kerr had already raised with Charles and Charteris in September, and that is the essential context for considering what may be in those letters. The palace letters then are extraordinarily significant historical documents. They're contemporaneous or real-time communications between the Queen and her representative in Australia, written at a time of great political drama, and they're a vital part of our national historical record. So how has this situation come about? How is it possible that for Kerr's correspondence with the palace, which are held by our own National Archives, the clear provision of the Archives Act, which is to make Commonwealth records available for public access after 30 years, do not apply? The answer is very simple. In fact, it's just one word: personal. With that simple designation of these letters as personal records and not Commonwealth records, the palace letters have been removed from the reach of the Archives Act, which relates only to Commonwealth records and under which those letters would then have had to be released in 2005, along with the rest of John Kerr's papers. And so, in a rather neat catch-22, the decision by the Archives to deny me access to the palace letters also cannot be appealed to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which is the usual appeal mechanism. There's only one way to challenge that decision, and that is through a federal court action, which is complex, expensive and onerous, as you can imagine. Nevertheless, thanks to a crowdfunding campaign and a remarkable legal team working on a pro bono basis, I was able to launch an action against the National Archives in the Federal Court in December 2016, seeking the release of the palace letters. So I just want to quickly thank all of the people who have supported that campaign through the Chuffed Release the Palace site, which is still open. And I acknowledge and thank the legal team, really remarkably generous legal team who are working on this case. The senior barrister, Anthony Whitlam, QC, whose name you would recognise as Gough Whitlam's eldest son, and with him, Tom Brennan, instructed by the Sydney law firm of Cause Chambers Westgarth. So, of course, I can't thank them enough. And without them, the case could simply never have taken place. This case against the National Archives concluded in a federal court in September last year, and we're now awaiting the decision. It's fair to say we're eagerly awaiting the decision, and it could come down at any time. But at the heart of this case is the central question of just what constitutes personal as opposed to Commonwealth records. Anthony Whitlam QC argued to the court that personal records in this instance would be records covering matters unrelated to the performance of Sir John's official duties and that could not possibly extend to correspondence between the Queen and her representative in Australia prior to the dismissal of a government. He said it cannot seriously be suggested that there was a personal relationship between the Queen and Sir John Kerr. And from a common sense perspective alone, it's certainly difficult to see that the correspondence between the Queen and her Governor General could in any way be seen as personal. However, the precise legal points on which the question of the status of the palace letters will turn will of course be a different matter. However, one thing that can be said is that from the moment this case came before the court, the question of the release of the palace letters changed irrevocably. Their status and their release will now be determined by an Australian court according to Australian law and not as a quasi-imperial grant of release by the Queen. And this alone is an historic result. But we actually do know something about the nature of those letters, since Kerr left a copy of extracts from some of them among his papers. These were in an unidentified file simply titled Extracts of Letters, which were placed in open access in the National Archives since no one realised that they were in fact extracts from the palace letters. And this is where I found them. And there are 6 of these extracts, and each of them describes contemporary political developments as they unfold. They're all entirely about political matters. There's quite simply no part of them, whether in style or content, that could be described as personal. And what is most significant is that the extracts show that the palace was well aware, at the very least, of the possibility of dismissal and certainly of the Governor General's deception of the Prime Minister about that possibility. Indeed, you could say the letters themselves are a part of that deception. In summing up our case that the palace letters are Commonwealth records, Anthony Whitlam pointed to the extraordinary corollary of the Archives' claim that the palace letters are personal and are not owned by the Commonwealth. If they're not owned by the Commonwealth, Whitlam asked, then who does own them? The Archives' contention is quite remarkable. The palace letters are owned by Mrs. Bashford. And who, you might ask, is Mrs. Bashford? She's the daughter of Sir John Kerr's second wife, who inherited her mother's estate and with that apparently Kerr's residual estate. So while Australians are denied access to the palace letters according to the Queen's embargo, Bashford alone has access to them and ultimate control over them. She could withdraw them from the archives, and indeed has already revised the conditions on them. She could destroy them, or as Anthony Whitlam contended, she could sell them to a foreign government or even release them to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Such is the strange predicament of the palace letters as personal records and not owned by the Commonwealth. And the case has also shone a rare light on the inner workings of the Office of Governor General and the colonial presumptions underpinning it, much of which would shock those who believe that even as a constitutional monarchy, we have long since been freed of the residual colonial ties. And I can't say a great deal about matters which are still before the court. However, I can assure you that quasi-colonial civility is alive and well at Yarralumla. And the mere fact that the Queen can still prevent us from seeing her correspondence with the Governor-General highlights the viceregal relationship as one of the few remaining colonial relics, as Whitlam termed those residual ties, which have lasting impact on Australian governance and history. What all these archival encounters have shown is that the insistent circulation of a flawed dismissal narrative was much more than just a collation of errors, misinterpretations, historical amnesia, or even conscious bias, although it was all of those things. It was also a carefully crafted historical construction, an intervention in the process of history formation itself, through the deliberate withholding of information that would tell us otherwise, and the repeated circulation of a version of events that was known to be false. These depredations of history have been profound, but not impervious. And in recent years, they've steadily crumbled, finally collapsed, and are now being recast in a dynamic process of historical correction. This is an unusually dynamic history. It continues to evolve, and it is itself a reflection of sustained biographical endeavour. The full story of the dismissal of the Whitlam government can never be known while the palace letters remain hidden from us. The Queen's embargo of these historic documents simply continues the secrecy and the subterfuge that has marked the history of the dismissal for decades. It stands as an insistent yet disconsolate vestige of colonialism that continues to deny us access to our own history. And it also stands as a powerful reminder of the marvellous, transformative potential of biography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. We've got a few moments for questions, and it's the procedure here, the way this works, is that you catch the attention of the people who have the microphones who are circulating around, rather than catching my attention. So let's take the first question.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that overview of your methodical work and advancement of shining a light on the historical record. I'm wondering if you've also looked at the reasons for the dismissal with as much detail, and as to, well, this relates obviously to the Khemlani affair and the funding of government to top up deficits, and whether you see any justification in the actions that were taken, or do you see them only as political?
Well, just to answer your question about Khemlani, if you're referring to the so-called loans affair, that was the result of a 1974 Executive Council minute in which funds were to be raised to fund the Whitlam government's energy grid proposal, and it's not a relation to the dismissal. The dismissal was over. Ostensibly over the blocking of supply in the Senate and the resolution of that incident. I mean, Kerr's statement of reasons is very clear in what he describes there, and he describes the need, in his view, and obviously many legal figures and others disagree entirely with his view, but his view that a government had to retain supply through all times What has since become clear through the archives is that Whitlam was to call the half-Senate election, and that is the resolution of that point. It's often claimed that the half-Senate election was early. It was not early. It had been due at any time since June 1975. So there's no surprise that that was going to be the outcome of it. But if you look at reasons, the reasons to unpack are several-fold. There's Kerr's, there's Malcolm Fraser's and the opposition's for being so determined not to allow the Whitlam government to continue. And there's also more recently the British interests in this through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which I discuss in the Dismissal Dossier. I think the point at which they all coalesce, and for slightly different reasons, but politically all ending up at the same point, is over this question of the half-Senate election. And this is why I said today that to me, re-emerges as the central aspect in that. I don't have time to go into every single aspect of that, but if you have a look at the Dismissal Dossier, I argue very strongly that it was, certainly from the opposition's point of view, the fear of the half-Senate election, which Alan Reid, the very conservative journalist at the time, described as causing panic. That was the word he used, panic, in the opposition at that time, to do with a complicated algebra of the Senate, which meant that there was a brief period during which the Whitlam government would actually have gained control of the Senate. For different reasons, the FCO was also fearful of the half-Senate election. And Kerr himself was under enormous pressure, absolutely enormous pressure. So my concern as a political scientist is that the structures of democracy were so damaged in that single episode, not just because of the dismissal itself. I think, in fact, some of the things that Kerr did subsequently are more problematic than the dismissal. His failure to warn Whitlam, I don't think anyone now would accept that it was appropriate for the Governor General to dismiss without warning. Even Mason, when this material came out in the second volume of my biography, went on the record for the first and only time about his role, acknowledging that it had occurred. And he claimed that he repeatedly said to Kerr, "You must warn Whitlam." There are very few people now who would not accept that. So I think we have to look at what Kerr actually was thinking at that time. And one of the purposes of that small book, the Dismissal Dossier, is really to unpack some of the myths, of which I think the Khemlani Loans affair was actually one, because it was not an issue at that specific time.
So do we have another question? Have one down here.
Kerr seems to have left you a lot of clues. And I'm wondering what was his motivation in that on the one hand he wanted secrecy, and I know, for example, that he visited my friend Telford Conlon, Alf's son, and demanded back documents that he had from his father. So he was obsessed with secrecy, but yet he left all these clues. Why did he do that?
You're absolutely right. He did leave clues, and I can only assume he left them for someone like me to find them. And the reason is that what I realised is that, you know, and obviously as a biographer, one of the key things you're doing is you have to have a process of assessment of different types of material, and often very differently argued and presented material. The material that Kerr put in his memoir and in his public statements was always singular. It was always putting the narrative that I've really described today. In his papers, there are several writings in which he makes it clear that what he is saying in his public statements is simply always to repeat what has been publicly available. And he actually uses the term, "other than that, I will not go." So he never revealed his conversations with Charles, he never revealed his conversations with Mason. So what he did, though, was he left the parts of those that he wanted to become public. And I think that includes the extracts of the palace letters, because he desperately wanted those letters to be published. He actually approached Buckingham Palace in the early 1980s, asking for the terms of their release to be changed. And I can only imagine at this time that Buckingham Palace went into severe concerns about Kerr becoming a bit of a loose cannon about material that was not meant to be released. And with Mason's role, there are some fascinating and really quite disturbing letters between Kerr and Sir Garfield Barwick. They write to each other on the anniversary of the dismissal, 7 years after the dismissal on the 11th of November. And they discuss there with each other the simple fact that they're aware that Mason's role is not known, that the history is not aware of it, and what point should we allow, really, the public to become aware of Mason's role? And it's an extraordinary feeling to read letters between such senior people in our governance structure, discussing at what point they'll allow the Australian public to know the real story of the dismissal. And Kerr is very clear in that he would have liked Mason's role to be known, but he sort of reluctantly agrees, but not until after our deaths. And so they've reached an agreement that the role of Mason and others would become available after their death. And I find the sort of moral dimension of that really troubling, not prepared to wear the opprobrium of that during their lifetime. And yet I think what Kerr has done is actually leave his full description of Mason's role, and Mason did not, in substantive sense, didn't differ from that. So I think what you find in the archives is, by and large, it seems to be what actually happened, and certainly the Mason material has shown that. But I do think he left it to be found.
We are out of time for questions. I'm sure you have very many more, and perhaps Jenny will be able to talk later with you. Jenny, you used the two words there, fascinating and disturbing, very close to each other, and I think that's a very good characterisation of this terrific speech tonight. Thank you very much. And so we're now handing over to Della Rowley with an announcement to make.
So welcome to the 7th Hazel Rowley Literary Event and to the announcement of the 2018 Fellowship winner. I'm Della Rowley, Hazel's sister. So thank you, Jenny, for a most inspiring discussion. What interesting discoveries come from biographical research. The politics of biography can uncover secrets that many people would wish to remain secret. And I'm sure Hazel would have loved that intrigue and would have admired Jenny for taking on the Queen and the palace. So now is the time to announce the winner of the Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship. The fellowship is designed to encourage Australian authors to attain a high standard of biographical writing and to commemorate the life, ideas and writing of my sister Hazel. But before I announce the winner, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful partnerships that have enabled us to keep offering the fellowship. We're thrilled to be in our 7th year with 6 talented fellows, 2 published books, and 3 fellows with book contracts and soon to be published. Firstly, I wish to thank our ongoing donors and supporters without whom we couldn't do any of this, and I think that includes a lot of you. We're grateful also to Australian Communities Foundation, who look after our investment so well, and to the fabulous people at Writers Victoria here at the Wheeler Centre, who administer the application process and give us much support. So that's Adrian, Angela and Alexis, the A-team, we call them. I also wish to thank our judges, whose knowledge and generous enthusiasm has made the selection process such a pleasure over the years. To our past judges, Alex Miller, Jim Davidson, Janine Burke, and to our present judges, Jenny Hocking, Arnold Zabel, and Lynn Buchanan. Many, many thanks. Special appreciation also to Irene Tomaszewski and John Murphy, who've helped shortlist, beginning with me back in 2011 and remaining such loyal friends to Hazel and enthusiasts of the fellowship. The fellowship has grown over these last 7 years beyond our expectations, thanks to the effort of so many people. So this year we had a large field of applications and received 54 from all around Australia. From this field, it was an unenviable task to select the shortlist. We had a shortlist of 8, which included Catherine Bishop, Judith White, Clem Gorman, Jacqueline Kent, Drusilla Majeska, Gillian Graham, Andrew Ramsey and Diana James, all with excellent projects. The shortlist subjects included political history, science, memoir, Aboriginal land rights, music and art. The competition was fierce, making the final decision very difficult. However, the project that impressed the judges the most to win the 2018 Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship is Jacqueline Kent from New South Wales. Jacqueline won for her proposed biography of Vida Goldstein, who lived from 1869 to 1949. Vida, a Victorian woman, was an important figure in the suffragette movement in Australia and internationally. She lived an extraordinary life, standing for the Senate in 1903 and being a powerful advocate for women, for votes for women in England. She even has an electorate in Victoria named after her, the seat of Goldstein, in the Bayside suburb of Melbourne. Jacqueline is well placed to write a biography of such a determined and important political figure, having written a number of biographies, her most recent being about Julia Gillard. Jacqueline will tell you more about her project in a minute. But this year the judges decided to make a special award. This special Hazel Rowley Award we're presenting to someone who is a great innovator in the art of biography and memoir, one of Australia's finest writers. Drusilla Majesta, also from New South Wales. This special award acknowledges Drusilla's significant contribution to biography, spanning personal memoir to a more traditional form of biography. She has played with the genre in a variety of ways, sometimes using fiction techniques, such as in her book Poppy, written about her mother, and The Orchard, a sort of autobiographical meditation, and at other times drawing on extensive research to write her wonderful dual biography of two female artists in Stravinsky's Lunch. We were unanimous in our decision to recognise and honour her body of work with a special award, which also provides $15,000 to support her writing. Drusilla's current project is First Half Second, a memoir of the first part of her life and the second instalment of her memoir following the publication of Second Half First in 2015. Now I'd like to invite Jacqueline first, as the 2018 Fellowship winner, to receive her prize and tell us a little bit about her project. I always give one of Hazel's books to the winner, and this year I've decided to give Christina Stead, Christina Stead, because she was a contemporary of Vida Goldstein. Yes. So here's your cheque, thank you, and here's your book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Della. I cannot tell you how delighted and grateful I am to be the recipient of the award for 2018. And also, I'd like to say that how pleasant it is to receive this on International Women's Day. Particularly, and also, and of course, Hazel, having been the author of books about fascinating women, makes it even more delightful for me. Vida Goldstein was, as Della has said, was an extremely important, influential suffragist, not a suffragette. That's the English lot. Our lot of the suffragists. And as Della said, she stood for the Senate. She stood a total of five times for the Senate, and she never made it. In fact, women got the vote in 1903, and the first woman who sat in Parliament was 40 years later. There were two of them. There was Dorothy Tangney and Enid Lyons. So it took 40 years from the time women got the vote in Australia to when they were able to sit in Parliament. But a lot of the work was done, an enormous amount of the work was done by Vida, who was not only a very, very strong suffragist, but felt that it was extremely necessary for women to be in Parliament because it was just ridiculous that half the population had no say in legislation that was that affected them. And she was extremely strong about that. The other thing is, of course, that having written a biography of Julia Gillard, I was fascinated to trace the lines of communication between Vida and Julia Gillard. And in fact, there are some extraordinary similarities. One is that the support that both were given by women. Vida, if you look at the record, Vida had an extraordinary number of women who really supported her, helped her, brilliant women, intelligent women, very, very strong women. And of course, I think that you could say that their descendants are organisations like Emily's List, which helped Gillard on her way. And there were also the support of men and mentors who were, in Vida's case, it was her brother-in-law, Henry Hyde Champion. In Gillard's case, there were several men who helped her on her way up. And the thing that is really interesting too is the press treatment of both these women. I have to tell you that not an awful lot has got better since 1903. Because Vida Goldstein was subject to some absolutely hair-curling treatment as the first woman in the Western world who dared to put her head up and demand a right such as being in Parliament. And in fact, the thing that always got me, and I always remember this, is that she was terrified, Vida was terrified of mice, and she never let anybody know this because it's such a cliche, you know, eek, jumping on things. But Edwardian clothing is not really good if there are mice around. She was absolutely terrified that during her talks, some of her enemies would let loose some mice on the platform, which I think is absolutely horrendous. And of course, it's not exactly ditch the witch, but it's not far from it. The other thing that I'd like to say in conclusion is that Australia at the time was a social laboratory for the world, and Vida was right in the forefront of that. Absolutely, she was invited to go to America and also to England. And she was the first Australian, as far as I can work out, to meet President Theodore Roosevelt. She was a mover and shaker, and it is high time she was brought back into public consciousness. That is my job, and I'm very pleased and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to do it. Thank you.
And now I'd like to ask Drusilla to come up and receive the special Hazel Rowley Award, please. Congratulations. So the book that I'm presenting Drusilla with is Hazel's Richard Wright. I had a bit of difficulty deciding which one for Drusilla, but it's the hardest one to get. And so the most likely she hasn't read. So your check and your book.
Thank you. I have actually read it, and I have given my copy to somebody. And in the way of these things, it hasn't come back. So I'm extremely happy to have this, and I don't have to go pursuing it. Thank you. And most of all, I want to say thank you that I'm really, really honoured by this award. Was just kind of bowled over and astonished when Della told me that this was what they had decided to do. And I'd really like to thank the judges. And I'd also like to start, and also, of course, thank Hazel, most of all. And I'd also like to give a bow to Jackie and also to all the other people on the shortlist, because when I read that shortlist, I thought it's a pretty tough shortlist, but I also thought biographical writing is in good shape in this country, and Hazel would be proud. And I think that what we have to thank her for is, you know, her books and for the work she did, but also for the standard that she set us. I put in my application for this to write, as Della said, the second half of my memoir. I get in the muddle, first half, second. Tonight, what I want to tell you about is that in the intervening time, just in the last couple of months, I've suddenly gone launching off in rather a different direction. It's still very biographical. And I will indeed write the memoir. I will be onto it but before the end of the year, and I will, of course, acknowledge Hazel Rowley Award, but I shall also acknowledge it in this other piece that I'm writing, which is sort of a long essay, perhaps a short book. And it came out of a kind of conjuncture of things recently. Reading Mary Darisek's book on the German artist Paula Modersohn-Becker, which many of you might have read, it just came out quite recently, and reading that while the Me Too campaign was swirling around, and at the same time that Jacinda Ardern was having to insist that she was pregnant, not incapacitated, and that government would continue. And at the same time, there were some extraordinarily tawdry events happening in Canberra that seemed to focus yet again on the bodies of women. And it reminded me and made me think of Simone de Beauvoir, who of course was Hazel's first biographical subject in her doctoral work. And Simone de Beauvoir said in 1949, man is defined as a human being and woman as a female. Women's bodies, women's selves, and you think, is this still an issue that we have to contest and protest and resist? And it seems, I'm afraid, that we do. So this got me thinking with Paula Modersohn-Becker, as I'm sure many of you will know, was the first woman who painted a self-portrait in the nude. Not only that, at her absolutely glorious, if any of those of you who've seen it, life-size 1906 self-portrait on my 6th wedding anniversary is the title of the self-portrait. She paints herself pregnant while she's not pregnant. She was separated from her husband. She was very definitely not pregnant. It's an astonishingly beautiful representation of the kind of the doubly creative nature of women, which is both the possibilities that it raises, but also the dilemma. And it's a painting that takes on a harsh and ironic edge when you know that a year later in 1907 she was pregnant and would die of a pulmonary embolism 2 weeks after the birth of her daughter. And she was just 31 years old. So when a woman of talent, such talent, an artist, dies so young, there's a temptation to think, try to imagine a life for her. What would she have done? What would her work have been? What greater loves and fuller loves and greater independence might she have? But that is not a biographical task, and I'm coming to this in that hat. And what it made me realise that when a woman's work hits, kind of touches something resonant in a culture, touches something that is due its time, in fact, in her case, probably early in her time, her work and her legacy will find shape in the work of those to come. So what I'm suddenly found myself doing, and I'm now writing this piece about, is going back to look at the work of other women who were born at that transition point at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, to see how they painted the female body, the female self, and their challenge to the ways in which we're seen and we can see ourselves as human women. I don't have time to tell you much about them now, but I can tell you that I've never enjoyed writing anything more, which might be due to the fact I'm old, or it might be due to the confidence boost that this award has given me, because I was just thinking about it at that moment when I heard, and I thought, yeah, why not? Go for it. Or, more likely and seriously and most seriously, it's due to the courage of the women who have painted themselves under circumstances that we can barely imagine and should not forget. Charlotte Solomon's cry for freedom in the 800 gouaches that she painted in the 18 months before she was deported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered. She was 27 and 5 months pregnant. Or the American photographer Lee Miller, her extremely radical photo of herself in Hitler's bath, when, as a US war photographer, oddly enough for Vogue, and she'd been a very beautiful woman and a model and had been doing all of those sorts of things, she ends up as this photographer, war photographer, one of the first photographers at all into some of the camps. She comes into Munich because she's billeted in the apartment that included Hitler's apartment and his bath, and no one else was the only place left for her and her companion, the other fellow thing. And she did this astonishingly radical critique in Hitler's bath, which some of you will know, it's a very famous image. And then there are not a lot of these women. An awful lot of them have died in the war or straight after the war, and then there are a few who live on. And of those who did live to be old, there's Louise Bourgeois, who I'm sure many of you will know of her, what she titled a self-portrait, which is a torso covered in carved vaginas. And my absolute favourite is Alice Neal, another American who lived in awful poverty, had a very, very difficult life, very little money, lived in a tiny room, children, the whole thing, kept on painting, was neglected way up until the 70s when she was discovered by sort of second wave feminism. And at the age of 80, at the age of 84, in 1984, she was born in 1900, she paints herself. She's the first woman to paint a nude self-portrait of herself old. And there she is, baggy and saggy, and sitting in her chair with her brush aloft. I could go on, but I won't. Time's up, and I want to say thank you again to all of you here and to the Hazel Rowley Award judges and administrators, and most of all to Hazel and the courage of all the women who have gone before us. Thank you.
So thanks, Jacqueline and Drusilla. Most interesting to hear about your projects. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight and showing your support for writers of biography. Please keep donating to the Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship so that we can continue enjoying ourselves by providing much needed support to biographers. There are books at the back and some of the authors will be signing them. I know Jenny and John and Drusilla's books are there. And we'll see you all in Adelaide, hopefully, in March 2019 as part of Adelaide Writers' Week when we announce the 2019 Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship winner. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.